three utterly related, intertwined orthodoxies regarding China, which I want to debunk today. Firstly is that China is suffering from underconsumption. Secondly, that China is cheating when it comes to the export game because of subsidies. And thirdly, China is cheating because of capital controls that stop the Chinese currency, the yuan, from devaluing. The underconsumption myth is due, of course, to a very startling statistic that only 40% of Chinese GDP is consumed, goes to consumption. But the reason for this anomaly is not that consumption has grown slowly. It is that the other big component of GDP in China, investment in infrastructure, in real estate, in export industries, has grown much faster, averaging 10% a year during this century. But this does not mean that the Chinese consume too little. It means that China invests a lot more than we in the West do. Now, the evidence is clear. Consumer spending is on a steady growth trajectory in China. The working class are clearly spending more from a rising disposable median income, while luxury stores, we can see that from Shanghai to Paris, are full of richer Chinese buyers. So if spending is weakening, it is not on goods, but on services. But even that is not a sign of weakness in spending either. The government, following the advice of many, some of those advisors came from the West, the government has been subsidizing healthcare and education. So the result is that while more healthcare and education is provided, private expenditure on these services, important services, is weakening. Now, isn't that what Britain's government promised but failed to deliver? Isn't that what most EU governments have promised but not delivered? This brings me to the other side of the argument, that China overinvests. Well, overinvests in relation to what? Should they not have invested in magnificent railways, in green energy, in batteries, in electrifying the country to become independent from the whims of the fossil fuel industry? Of course they should. I wish we had done so in Europe. A Europe that has been experiencing an investment strike for almost 2 decades now. Let me now turn to the second orthodoxy, that Chinese exporters rely on subsidies to warp the playing field and take out competitors unfairly. Now, there are of course subsidies. But I have looked at the numbers, and there is zero evidence that Chinese exporters enjoy more state assistance than equivalent American exporters or French exporters or German manufacturers. A quick perusal, if anybody who's been to a Chinese factory, even to a farm these days, that's enough to convince the most skeptical of observers that they are trading on superior productivity, on capital intensity, of AI that is not being used in order to write poetry, as it is in the West, but it is used in order to increase productivity in workplaces. That their success is due to having avoided Europe's fixation with competitiveness, which I mentioned in the previous section, I think that is a merit for China. They have instead a fixation with productivity. I wish we had done that in Europe. And now I'll come to the third orthodoxy, that China cheats because it practices capital controls, and through these keeps its currency low. Well, it does. But what's wrong with that? Have we forgotten that the golden age of Western capitalism was the 1950s and the 1960s, the period of the Bretton Woods system, when the capital controls were part and parcel, an integral part of the architecture. And what was the point of Bretton Woods? It was to maintain American surpluses. You have to remember that the United States came out of the Second World War in the late 1940s and early 1950s as the only creditor country, the only surplus country. And the whole point of dollarizing Europe and Japan and creating the Bretton Woods system was to keep the value of the dollar down through capital controls and effectively manage the surpluses of the United States in a way that recycles them in Europe and in Japan. And that system worked magnificent. That's why we had the golden age of capitalism, as long as America had surpluses. And of course, it was blown up by Richard Nixon on the 15th of August, 1971, when America no longer had surpluses. And we moved into the period of so-called globalization, financialization, neoliberalism, and so on. So the big question now is this. When will China create its own Bretton Woods? in order to manage aggregate demand beyond its borders, which it must do if it's going to stop exporting deflation, which it is doing now, because any country that exports so much compared to what imports is exporting deflation, crisis. So the question is, are they going to do a Bretton Woods within the BRICS area or some other kind of agglomeration to recycle their own surpluses abroad? If they don't, then I think that geopolitically this is going to be tension-inducing, and I would not be surprised if that, in the end, brings about, a kind of rupture that may end up jeopardizing China's progress. Maybe China will have its own Nixon shock, bypassing its own Bretton Woods BRICS period. But nevertheless, those three orthodoxies need to be debunked before we have a serious conversation about China.
Yeah, I would agree that the orthodoxies of international macroeconomics have persistently failed to analyze what's happening in China. It's always assumed that this thing would blow up, there would be a bubble, that China is unsustainable, and it has proved more sustainable than we think, pursuing policies that it shouldn't, under these orthodoxies, not pursue. I agree also with one of your comments about subsidies. I think this is a very common misunderstanding also in Europe, especially in Europe, that China is subsidizing industries. China acts like a venture capitalist. So it throws a lot of seed money at new technologies or new sectors that it identifies as important, like the cars or the electric batteries. The seed money generated a lot of initial investments by companies, and it created brutal competition. And only a number of these companies survived. Many died, and those that survived were very strong. They're not subsidized. In the car industry right now, the Europeans subsidize more than the Chinese. The Germans are just massive subsidies, energy subsidies, EV subsidies. That's kind of a category error. Now you could say, okay, it's an unfair competition because they got the seeding. Our companies get bank finance, which is less attractive, and that may well be true. But it means it's a different model. I mean, the American companies fund themselves through very liquid capital markets. We don't have that in Europe either. The Chinese model has proved to be the first real alternative to the kind of capital markets-based model. I think most people here in the West thought it isn't possible. I think the American model is the only one that works, the only one that generates wealth. It's not true. The Chinese one has. It doesn't. I don't think it's our model. I think China is not the system that Europeans will emulate. We should certainly not follow this complacent, end of history nonsense to think that communism has been defeated. It hasn't. Communism is working there. It's a version of communism that is highly successful. It doesn't mean we should be communist. I certainly don't believe that. We have to recognize that this is a viable system, and it's not going to collapse. It's not going to collapse under its contradictions. But I have to say much more critically about China. China is a neo-mercantilist. So what China is doing, very much like what Germany is doing, except it's doing it more successfully and on a much, much larger scale. Germany never had choke points. So if Germany gets tariffed by, as it does now by Donald Trump, they really have a problem. China has ways to respond to that by withholding exports, by withholding, when they stopped Nexperia export. This was a Dutch company that was previously Chinese owned and then nationalized in the Netherlands, and China responded by blocking exports of that company, because the company was producing in China, blocking exports of that company to Europe, and all the European car companies were running out of chips very quickly. Or the Chinese putting export licenses on rare earths and other minerals that they have a quasi-monopoly over. That these are choke points. These are geopolitical choke points that China is using, which is why the rest of the world isn't reacting to China the way it is. I mean, when Donald Trump announced his Liberation Day tariffs, China immediately retaliated, and Trump kind of caved in because he relies on Chinese rare earths just for the military. I mean, the F-35s have a lot of this stuff inside of them. The question I have about this policy, it works like a charm in the short run. But one of the things that I see happening, and the Germans are at it, and others are at it, they're trying to develop materials and technologies around this. So the chokehold for rare earths will not be as strong in 10 years as it is today, because people will invent new technologies that make them less dependent. And I think everybody needs to consider the use of their chokeholds. It's the same with the Americans when they use the dollar as a sanction tool. I think this is dangerous, because it will ultimately get people to use other systems like cryptocurrencies. And I see a vulnerability coming up here. Not in the immediate future. I think China is probably more robust than we think, or than Western sort of establishment thinking things. But I think there is something coming up, and the argument we had against neo-mercantilism, as it applies to Europe, applies to China on an even larger scale.
I'm very interested in the point you made about the model by which aggregate investment is managed. In the United States, it's managed through Wall Street. It's managed through venture capitalists. It follows that financial markets pattern. In China, you have a variety of different kinds of sources. You have banks, some of them are private, some of them are state. You have a lot of financing that comes from the prefectures, leveraging land use in order to do that. And it seems to me that from just inspection of what's happening in the United States vis-a-vis what's happening in China, the investment terrain is far more competitive in China. So there's a wall of money that goes to many, many more people, many, many more companies, many, many more startups, some of which die, some of which survive, a much smaller percentage, than in the United States. Today, if you look at flows of private capital in the United States, you'll find that, big tech is, for instance, Google investments. It's behind almost, 5,500 startups. And what they're doing there is they're introducing a clause every time they sponsor one of these or, infuse capital into one of these startups. Google Investments has a non-competition clause. That is, you're not allowed, whatever service or app you come up with, to compete with any of Google services. So it's a kind of a monopoly system. Whereas in China, they come down like a ton of bricks on attempts to monopolize, especially big tech. I remember having this conversation, the conversation that you started, Wolfgang, with somebody high-ranking in Beijing. And, I asked the question that you're sort of implying, what happens if the United States effectively tariffs you to, 200% levels and your flood of exports, even to the European Union, down? And he said, well, look, we have already 150 million digital wallets that belong to all sorts of small and medium-sized businesses and individuals, a stable coin effectively that is issued by the Central Bank of China. And we also have WeChat, which is a private version of it. And, we can simply adjust our demand simply by giving people credit to boost aggregate demand domestic. We don't want to do it, but if we have to, we're going to do it. You see, compare and contrast this with, firstly, we've already discussed this, you and I, what's happening in Europe, where, Christine Lagarde and the European Central Bank want to introduce the euro, but the banks do not allow them. Look at what's happening in the United States with the Genius Act. President Trump has effectively banned the Federal Reserve for having this facility that the Central Bank of China does, and essentially privatizes stable coins and sends them off to El Salvador with Tether and so on and so forth. So there's no doubt that the ruling class in the United States makes a lot more money out of this monopolized financial system, but the Chinese are managing to convert finance into productivity and output in a way that neither Europe, of course, Europe can't do it, can't even begin to imagine of dreaming about it, but also the United States can't.
Yeah, I have a more open mind about the United States. I certainly, I see many of the problems that come up with high tech and certainly with cryptocurrencies. But the US has, we have to acknowledge it's a system that has been working for a long time, generating very high growth rates for a very long time. The EU doesn't have that. The Chinese system is a completely different one. Both have succeeded in their own way. They're completely incompatible. But it sort of teaches us that there isn't just one way. It teaches us there are different ways of of generating wealth. And the EU actually had one at a time. I mean, this sort of the state investment banking. This was actually sort of an idea pioneered by Jean Monnet, the founder of the EU in the 1950s. He was the president of the precursor, the European Coal and Steel Community. He pioneered this whole idea behind, the European Investment Bank, this whole idea of co-leveraging investments into industry. And it worked for industry. It worked for the kind of post-war industrial renaissance that Europe had. These investments played a huge role. The Germans had a bank very much modeled on this principle, the Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau, this the credit institution for reconstruction. And these models also worked exceedingly well until they didn't. And one has to sort of say that the Europeans haven't updated this, whereas the Chinese invented something completely different, and the Americans have really leveraged their capital markets. I think capital markets can work. I think for the Europeans, they would have needed to, and another opportunity lost. The euro could have given them the opportunity to reboot the banking system. At least then the global financial crisis would have been the real opportunity to do this. And they didn't do it. They didn't do it in 1999, they didn't do it in 2008, and they didn't do it in 2012. They have something called the banking union, but this is just jobs for regulators. This is not, this is not real. It has no economic meaning. So the Europeans haven't done that, and they're kind of stuck in their old systems. Viewers might think that I'm sort of turned into from a Europhile into a Eurosceptic. No, that's not the case. I remain a Europhile. My problem is that what I'm seeing in Europe is a structure that is no longer working. And I see it in economics, I see it in finance, and what I'm seeing in China is that there is a willingness to experiment with new ideas. And I think China is making mistakes, and China will come to rue some of them. But this will not become evident for a very long time. And right now they are the senior partner in all our trading relationships.
Well, to be a true Europeanist, you need to be proud and to defend the good things about Europe and be highly critical of all those things that are undermining Europe. And unfortunately, the purveyors of those things have been in government for far too long in Europe. I can see why, when you juxtapose Europe to the United States, you're so ebullient about the United States. And you're quite right. It does have a tremendous dynamism. But I think, here I'm going to say something good about Donald Trump. Please forgive me. His feel that the decline of American manufacturing undermines in the long term the capacity of big tech, of banking, of finance, and so on, to continue bring about not just growth. Growth you can bring about. You can create a huge bubble that keeps inflating for a very long time. But to continue to be consistent with, American significance, if not hegemony, I think he's right on that. Because, how we make stuff in the end shapes also our sciences, our character, our sense of pride. It turns out that the Chinese have learned how to do this much better than the Americans, and far, far, far better than Europeans. My concern about China is, firstly, the demographics, which are not working in favor of the country, a country that is very reluctant to bring in foreigners. And secondly, the question of authoritarianism. But then again, I live in Europe, where authoritarianism is rising its ugly head over the parapet on a daily basis.
A positive thing about China and the United States is they both have dared disruption. They have accepted disruption. They changed. The modernization that China undertook was difficult. It wasn't always popular. It met resistance. The American system lives on disruption. The capital markets, that's what capital markets do. They disrupt. They change. They don't subsidize dying industries. They reallocate capital. Whereas the reason why, industrial policy in Europe doesn't work is because we're not picking winners. We're actually subsidizing losers. We're only subsidizing companies that employ a lot of people, but that don't make any profit. That's how companies get subsidized. So the Germans subsidizing a dying car industry. Now, dying is maybe an exaggeration. They will still make cars in Germany, but they will not make a lot of money from cars. The times of the big bonanza is over. So rather than investing in new companies, they're not allowing these old companies to die and something new to grow. They're clinging on to the old stuff. My admiration for China in that respect is that they have done something that we Europeans have lost. And this is why I think the future, this is really a power battle, or the geopolitics is really between China and the United States. And it's not only because of the size and because of the weapons. It is about because of innovation. It is about the willingness to disrupt, and not just to disrupt other people, but also to disrupt themselves. That we Europeans have completely lost.